Okay, our second presentation is the homeless survey presentation by Timothy McLarney, President, True North Research Incorporated, and welcome, Mr.
Good evening,
McLarney.
Madam Mayor, members of council. Dr. Tim McLarney, President, True North Research, and we're a firm that specializes in working with public agencies around the state in using surveys to develop a statistically reliable understanding of the communities and the customers that they serve. To date, we've helped public agencies with over 1,000 research studies. More than 300 of those have been for California cities, but this is the first that I've ever had the privilege of designing and conducting that was totally about homelessness, right? Wasn't on the public radar, wasn't on a lot of agencies' radars 3-4 years ago. It's obviously changed a lot in recent times. And so it was a real good opportunity, interesting study. We have some interesting results that I'm here to share with you tonight. And as I go through the presentation, if you have questions, council, I would welcome those as I go or at the end, whichever is your preference.
Mr. McLarney, there was an announcement that I wanted to make before
Sure.
you started. Tonight, we are broadcasting this presentation live for our Facebook viewers on Facebook. And we don't normally do that. We do broadcast on our website, but we wanted to make it more available to the whole community. And for those watching on Facebook, we encourage you afterwards, if you want to continue to see what's happening on the meeting, to go to our city's website, and you can continue to watch the meeting live. Sorry for the interruption, and thank you very much.
No problem. So before we talk about the results, helpful to take a moment to talk about the purpose of the study or what we were trying to accomplish in doing this research, as well as the methodology or how we went about conducting the study. In terms of the purpose, we were really kind of focusing on 4 overarching objectives. We first wanted to simply get an understanding as to what extent is homelessness a concern of residents, and to what extent are they seeing this as a growing problem in the community. We wanted to understand from their perspective what they think are the big factors that are causing homelessness, right? Thirdly, we wanted to get an understanding of how they view homeless people in general, right? And then fourth, we were building up to how do they view and what is their support level for potential strategies or solutions for addressing the homelessness issue. In terms of the methodology or how we went about conducting this study, we use a methodology that's very similar to the methodology that we use for the city when we do your community satisfaction study. We start out with a random sample of adults in the community. We had set out to do about 400, I believe. We wound up coming back in with 608. So we had a higher level of participation in the study than we had sort of conservatively estimated. We used a mixed method approach where we're recruiting using both telephone and email, right? And we're giving individuals the opportunity to participate in the study either by telephone if that was their preference or online at a password protected website. The reason why we password protect it, we want to make sure that only individuals who were invited to take the survey were allowed to access the site. That's what preserves the integrity of the study. These were folks that were selected at random, so we want to keep it a random sample. And on issues like this, occasionally you might have somebody who has strong opinions and they want to share them multiple times. And so by password protecting, we ensure that every individual who takes a survey can do it one time, right? They can't take it multiple times and they can't pass it on to their friends for them to take the survey as well. So that's what protected the integrity of the study. Now, because this was a random sample of 608 and not a census of all of your adult residents, it has what's known as a margin of error due to sampling. In this case, that's plus or minus 3.3%. What that means is we can be 95% confident that the results I'll share tonight are within 3.3% of what we would have found had we spoken with all of your adult residents. Okay. So we ask a little warm-up question up front, and it's also a bit of a setup question. Simply ask them to tell us how they would rate the overall quality of life in Glendora. Would they say it's excellent, good, fair, poor, or very poor? And you can see here on the slide that you had overall 87% or almost 9 out of 10 rate the quality of life as excellent or good. You had about 11% who said fair, and you had less than 2% who said poor or very poor. We followed this question up, what I meant by setup is we followed this question up with the next one, which was an important one, where we asked, if the city government could change one thing to make Glendora a better place to live now and in the future, what change would you like to see? By open-ended, what I mean is we didn't provide the list that you see there on that slide. They got to tell us in their own words. Either they told us on the telephone interview or they typed it in We went back and looked at those verbatim responses, and then we grouped them into the categories you see here based on that analysis. And what you find was the number one issue in the community was, in fact, homelessness and poverty. 27% mentioned that issue. Yet about 14% who weren't sure, couldn't think of the most important issue. And then followed by improving streets, roads, and infrastructure at 14%, and limiting growth, development, preserving small town feel at about 12%. What's interesting about this question is we purposely had it be identical to a question that we've asked in your earlier community surveys. So the same question was asked in 2018, and the same question was also asked in 2016. And what you see is a real trend in the homelessness as an issue. So in this year is 27%. In 2018, right, so not that long ago, 8% mentioned homelessness. And in 2016, it was 2%. So you get a sense from there, just by comparing those three snapshots in time, that the perception of homelessness as an important issue in the community has grown. We also, though, asked the question specifically, over the past 3 years, would you say that the amount of homeless people in the city of Glendora has decreased, stayed about the same, or increased? And as you can see here on this slide, you have better than 2/3 say that they see the number of homeless in the community is increasing during this period of time. About 18% said it's about the same. Just 2% feel that the amount of homeless has decreased in Glendora. The other thing, and I don't have a slide on this because there's more in the full report, but when you asked individuals sort of what's the source of homelessness, are these Glendora residents who have become homeless, or is this an imported problem, meaning these are folks who are living somewhere else, became homeless, and have now landed in Glendora? And what you find is it's about 10-to-1 ratio of the people who see it as an imported problem versus a homegrown problem. You had 60% who feel that these are individuals who were homeless before they got here in Glendora, and just 6% who see it as being largely Glendora residents who are now homeless. So we shifted gears then to get a feel for what residents perceive to be the causes of homelessness. And for each of the issues there on the left side, we simply asked them to tell us, is this a big factor in causing homelessness, which is that dark blue bar, a medium factor, a small factor, not a factor, or were they not sure? And one of the things that really jumps off the page there, you see the top three bars there, a lot of dark blue. You had 2/3 plus of respondents say that each one of those items, drug addiction and abuse, or drug abuse, mental illness, as well as alcohol addiction or alcohol abuse, were big factors in causing homelessness. So this is one of the areas where you have a bit of consensus to some degree within the community. The next two ones down, making bad decisions, about 39% said that's a big factor. Shortage of affordable housing, 41%. And then we tested laziness at 24%, shortage of good paying jobs, 19%, and then just bad luck at 10%. And so it gives you a sense of how the community views the causes of homelessness. And we also wanted to get a sense for how they view homeless people, right? And so we had 4 statements that we tested that are shown on the left side of that slide, and simply asked them to tell us, do you agree or disagree with this statement, and to what extent? And what's interesting in the aggregate is you see a bit of a mix. So at the top, that top bar, was the statement, homeless people represent a threat to public health. 73% agreed with that statement. You also see that about 55%, or majority, agreed that homeless people are more dangerous than the average person, which is the bottom bar there, right? So those are two sort of negative views of homeless people. In the middle, we have sort of second from the top there. With a little help, many homeless can get back on their feet. You had 60% who agreed with that. And most homeless people are good people, but they have fallen on hard times. Here again, you have a little over 60% there. And so in the aggregate, it's this interesting mix, right? Of, on the one hand, sort of negative statements about homeless get, majority plus support or agreement. But also these positive statements about homeless also get a majority of folks agreeing with the statement. What appears to be kind of mixed views in the aggregate overall, when you look at it at the individual level, right? So you go in and for each individual respondent and you look at how they answered those questions, you can create what's called an index variable, and you can rate people on this index variable. And when you do that, what happens is your residents sort of fall into one of 3 camps here, which you see there on that slide, and they're fairly equally balanced, right? You have about 36% of residents who sort of wind up in the bucket of having negative views of homeless people, right? They're more likely to see them as dangerous. They're more likely to see them as a threat to public health. They don't see them as sort of being easily helped, right? Or getting back up on their feet, et cetera. On the other hand, you have about a third of folks who have positive views, right, of the homeless. They don't see them as much as a threat. They don't see them as being more dangerous than other people. But they do tend to have these more positive views in terms of all they need is a little bit of a helping hand. They've just had some hard times. And then you get about 29% who are right in the middle, right? They kind of have both of those views, right? They hold them together. The reason I show you this slide is because throughout the report, this becomes a really useful way of segmentation scheme for understanding all the other questions that we ask in the report, because there are some, if you know where somebody lands on this sort of chart, you can learn a lot about and know a lot about how they view the causes of homelessness as well as their views about solutions. There's also some very interesting demographic correlations with each one of those, right? That if you look at those folks who have generally negative views, for example, tend to be older, tend to be homeowners, more likely to report encountering homelessness in the community. They are actually, interestingly enough, more likely to have a family member who is or has been homeless. And some other factors. And so there's some interesting demographic correlates to each one of these. So we did ask questions of folks in terms about their experiences with homelessness in the community. And for the pie chart here is we simply asked them, how often do you encounter homeless people in Glendora? Would that be every day, a few times a week, a few times a month, less often? And what you see is almost 2/3 of residents reported that they encounter homeless people in Glendora at least several times per week, right? That it's a very common occurrence. We did also, in terms of experiences, ask them to what extent they've taken any actions related to homelessness. So, have they donated money to an organization that helps homeless? About a little more than a third said yes to that. Have they talked with a homeless person in Glendora? Also about a third. Whether they'd offered money or food to a homeless person in Glendora. Here again, we have about a third of folks saying yes to that. Less than 13% of folks indicated that they volunteered to help the homeless, and only about 11% mentioned that they'd contacted the city of Glendora about a homeless person or homeless issue. So for the most part, the average resident hasn't taken any actions related to homelessness that we tested here. Now, homelessness is one of those interesting issues where, there's some types of issues where if you've got potholes in the street, you know exactly what agency to go talk to, right? You go talk to the city, or if it's county, you go talk to the county. Homelessness is a problem that doesn't have an obvious sort of jurisdiction within one agency. And so we wanted to ask Glendora residents who they felt or what agencies they feel should have a big role or a medium role or small role in addressing homelessness. And what you see here overall is that the state of California and the county of Los Angeles were the two sort of government agencies that rose to the top of the list in terms of most people seeing them playing a big role in addressing homelessness. Followed by the city of Glendora, you had about half of residents seeing the city as playing a big role, then the federal government, and then community-based organizations and churches. And only about 16% of folks felt that local business community should play a big role in addressing homelessness. Here again, I went back to that chart about do you have a negative view or a positive view or neutral view of homeless people. That colors how they answer this question. If you have a positive view of homeless folks, you tend to spread the responsibility widely, right? Meaning you tend to say, yes, 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 all of these agencies should have a big role in addressing homelessness. If you have a negative view of homeless people, they really tend to emphasize the state, the county, and the city, right? And they put less emphasis on the other agencies. Now moving on to potential strategies and solutions. And so here we presented to them, first of all, we helped explain to them at first that court rulings have determined that you cannot remove a homeless person from public property unless you have alternative shelter available to them. That's I think it's City of Boise versus Martin. And so for a lot of residents, we asked them whether they even heard of that, right? Because most people say, well, why can't, if I'm inclined to say, why can't we just move them out of the parks if they're in the parks? Well, you have to go to the courts, you have to have alternative suitable housing or shelter for them to be able to go to. And so we first preface this question by explaining that. Only about half of residents had even heard of that court decision. So once we sort of got that on the table, so everybody had that common understanding, we then went on to ask whether they would support or oppose several strategies for addressing homelessness in Glendora that we list here on the slide. And the top tier at the top are providing counseling and rehab for drug and alcohol addiction, which lines up with that widely perceived causes of homelessness, right, from the public's perspective. Providing funding for mental health facilities. Also, we saw mental health was one of the dominant causes from the public's perspective in terms of causing homelessness. And then also joining with other cities in the county to create more regional homeless shelters. Those three strategies had the strongest support among your residents. From there, it kind of goes downhill in terms of support level. Providing homeless for people who lived in Glendora prior to being homeless. So if you're a Glendora resident and then you became homeless. Incentivizing underperforming hotels and motels to accept temporary housing vouchers, and then creating a temporary homeless shelter in Glendora, providing rent subsidies to the homeless, building additional low-income housing in Glendora, and expanding the number of homeless people who receive welfare benefits. You can see that as you go down that list, those levels of support go down and down. Interestingly here too, if you look at how people answer these questions or their support level for these strategies according to their views of homeless people, as well as whether they see homelessness as a big problem in Glendora, those two groups, if you have a negative view of homeless people, and if you view homelessness as being a big problem in Glendora, you're the least likely to support any of these solutions, right? So it's the people who have a more positive view of homeless that tend to have the stronger support for all the solutions we tested here, and also people who don't see homelessness as big of a problem, ironically. So in terms of funding, one of the things that I think all government agencies are struggling with is, okay, it's a problem, but how do you address it in terms of funding? So we asked individuals whether they would support or oppose each of the strategies you see here on the slide. You do find that you have more support for working with nonprofit organizations to raise private funds for the development of low-income housing in Glendora. So I think the key is nonprofit, private, and public dollars. Seeking grant funding to build emergency homeless shelters in the city of Glendora. Here again, grant funding, right? Not sort of coming out of the city's coffers, not coming out of taxes. Those two strategies have the most support. Everything else below that ticks below the majority support level. That's providing incentives to developers to build more affordable low-income housing in Glendora. I think you have a couple of issues popping up there. Raising local taxes $50 per year for residents and local businesses to address homelessness, and then also taking a portion of the funding that the city that currently goes to other city services like street maintenance, parks, and police, and use it to build homeless shelters. That had the least amount of support of all the strategies that we tested. So those last solutions before the funding slide were more about if you think about carrot and stick, that's more carrot, right? How do we get them into housing? How do we help homeless connect to mental health counseling, drug and alcohol counseling? We also asked a question about this, that the city could take certain actions to discourage homeless people from staying in certain areas of the city. So we tested 4 of those. And what you saw at the top of the list, there were 2 that had widespread support: enforcing a no-tolerance policy for any bad behavior, including drug or alcohol use, littering, aggressive panhandling. You had 88% who supported that. Enhancing the lighting in public areas to discourage people from using these areas to sleep. Also 83% support. The next 2 were really split kind of right down the middle. Closing certain parks to the public so they can't be used for homeless camps. As I mentioned, if you don't have alternative suitable shelter for them, then you can't remove them from public property or in camping in parks. And so that was one of the strategies that you can deal with, is closing certain parks to keep that from happening. And then also modifying street benches so it's not comfortable to lie down on them. And there you had about 50% again who supported that. Here's the one area where the folks with negative views of the homeless have the strongest support, right? And so, again, if you understand how people view homeless people, you tend to have really good insight into what they view as the causes of homelessness. those correlate highly, and also what type of strategies they propose for dealing with the homeless. Okay, couple of conclusion slides. So one of the obvious takeaways from the study is that homelessness is really a top of mind concern for your residents. I talked about how when you look back over time, when we've asked that open-ended question of what's the most, what could the city do to improve the quality of life in Glendora, we found that homelessness as an issue went from almost not on the radar in 2016 to being the #1 issue today, right? So it's really grown, and people see it as a widespread, as a growing problem. It's also a problem that they see as being imported, right? It's not homegrown, it's coming from outside. We do also see that nearly 2/3 of your residents reported that they encounter homelessness several times a week, at least. And so it's a growing concern. We also saw, as I mentioned, that views of homeless people are mixed. You have some folks who take a more positive, charitable view of homeless folks. You have some that take a more negative view, and you have some that are sort of in the middle. It's really important you understand that, because those groups see any policy solutions very differently, right? And so that breakout becomes pretty instructive as you look through the report. We do see, despite positive and negative views, that there is some consensus on the perceived causes of homelessness, right? We saw that about 2/3 see that drug addiction and abuse, alcohol addiction and abuse, and mental illness are all big factors in causing homelessness. And as I mentioned, the opinions about what the causes of homelessness are strongly correlated with how you view homeless people, and also your support for certain strategies. And then finally, we do see that there's strong support for some of the strategies that were tested in the poll, right? Addiction counseling, mental health facilities, regional homeless shelters, as well as a no tolerance policy within the city for bad behavior, and also enhancing lighting to discourage sleeping in certain areas of the public. So that sort of suite of strategies, we had strong support within the survey from your residents. We found moderate support for providing housing to homegrown homeless, meaning Glendora residents who became homeless, as well as closing parks or modifying street benches to discourage sleeping in public areas. And then finally, from a solution perspective, grants, private funding, anything that's not public dollars, you're not diverting money from existing services, those were popular, right? There wasn't a lot of tolerance for raising taxes to deal with this issue, and they don't want to see money moved, for the most part, from any of your other services to deal with it. So that is the end of my presentation. I welcome questions for Council if there are any.
Thank you. That was a really clear presentation, and appreciate your summary.
Thank you.
Questions or comments?
Well, one thing that struck me is that when you talked about solutions to discourage camping, there was strong support for enforcing that, upwards of 90%, either by enforcement or adding lighting to discourage sleeping in the areas. As opposed to we're looking at the overall perception of 2/3 of the people were able to answer questions that basically they have a positive or a neutral view of homeless. I'm just wondering if those questions were skewed in such a way, because those two numbers don't jive. It doesn't make sense to me.
Well, you can have, I think, these are not hard lines between some of these the opinions of homeless people, for example, and policy, right? They're correlated, but they don't line up perfectly. And you do find that even within some residents, they hold these sort of, views that are a little bit of tension between them. On the one hand, they view homeless as a threat, right? And they see them as more dangerous and a threat to public health. But on the other hand, they go, I don't kind of blame them. They've probably just fallen on hard times, and, with some help, they can get back on their feet. The same person could hold all those views within their head, right? They don't have to have one or the other. Some people do, but you can have this sort of tension. I think what you're seeing here is that, like there is support for some, and we've done other studies, not full-blown studies on homelessness, but we've looked at homelessness in other communities, and what you tend to find is that you do have some folks in the community that they'll support the carrot and they'll support the stick, meaning I'm good with connecting people to services and counseling and mental health treatment. At the same time, I don't want them in the parks, right? And I agree with turning on the lights and doing what we can to discourage that. And if we have to close parks, so be it, right? So you can have those opinions sort of all at the same time, right? Not everybody does, but that's what I think you're seeing here is there's some overlap.
Oh, this is a problem that everybody struggles with. Nobody knows what the answer is to try to deal with this, and we all agree that something needs to be done. Mm-hmm. It's just a matter of what. And if that wasn't skewed in any way, to me, it's a sign that, even though as giving and charitable as Glendora is, that the camping and sleeping in the public areas is an issue, and for the most part, our hands are tied with that issue. So, that's just one takeaway that I got from this. So I appreciate if those numbers are just what they are, that's telling to me. So that was the only question I had. Thanks.
Thanks, Gary. Mindel?
Yeah, just one question, but thank you for this this great tool. It's good to hear from what people think. It's good to hear how you've been able to quantify it, and I think it's going to be an excellent tool for us to take and to enable us to respond. You said this is kind of the first big one of these that you've done. So what would you say were the surprises that you maybe thought from a analytical standpoint that you would see that maybe you didn't see, or maybe you did see?
Coming into this, again, we had done some of this work for other
Right.
cities, but smaller number of questions, right? We didn't kind of
Right.
take that holistic approach like we did here. I was really struck by, I keep mentioning the correlations between the views, and if you understand where they are here, then you've got a really good insight into where they're going to land on policy,
Right.
how they view people. That was what struck me. It was so interesting. It's also very interesting that some of the demographic groups and how they line up with views of homelessness aren't what you might expect, right? And I get into that in the report, but there's some, types of behaviors that you would think, well, certainly that's the kind of group that's going to be supportive and have a positive view of homelessness and favor some of these, encouraging strategies. And yet when you dig into the data, you realize, it's the reverse,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And that was surprising to me because I haven't had a chance to look at all the pieces before like we did here, right? So, the report itself gets into a lot more of those details,
Right, it
and
does.
it's I wouldn't say that any, I don't want to toot my own horn because not all my research reports are interesting. They'll probably put you to sleep after 10, 12 pages. This one's a little bit of a page turner. Right?
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
No, it was interesting to read.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
my pleasure.
That's all.
Karen?
Thank you for giving us this information. Fortunately, it solidifies some of the comments that we hear and that we know exist in the community. So what it confirms for me is that we need to do a lot more education and share a lot more information to address some of those comments or beliefs that were reflected. And I think that as a result of this information now, that there's probably a few more steps that we need to take going forward. So later in the meeting, I'll ask for some future agenda items to do that. But thank you. And I think that was helpful too, the way you correlated, because as I read it, I was doing the same thing. Well, probably the person that answered this probably answered this, and so you can. But thank you.
Michael?
Thank you, Judy. I always enjoy all your surveys that you do for us. They're really enlightening. I really enjoy them. They're really well done. But you said you did a limited number of these for other cities, but not as much. Do you have any parallels with demographics, just anecdotally, that you have from Glendora, our demographics, to other demographics?
In the limited number of studies that I've done with this, I don't know that there's a lot of parallels. I can tell you we've asked questions about this in City of Oceanside, right? Their demographics are a little different than yours. And also City of Santa Barbara, right? Santa Barbara has probably longer than many cities in other parts of Southern California. They've wrestled with the homelessness issue up there, right? But the demographics there again are very different. There's probably more of a dichotomy between. It's a very affluent community. The housing market is sky high, right? And yet they at the same time have a real significant homeless issue and problem there. And so I don't know how much I could correlate between that. I tend to find that what's particularly interesting is looking within Glendora and looking at the demographic comparisons there. And there's some tables in the report there that'll show you that sometimes you look at attitudes and they don't necessarily correlate real well with demographics, right? Other times they do. And here you have some pretty strong correlations between views on homelessness and certain demographic characteristics.
Right, but this is more of an in-depth that you did here in Glendora than you did anywhere else. But
Correct.
was there anything that were similar results that you have from any of the questions that may have been parallel?
Well, I think the one thing when I was talking about the fact that people can hold both of these, what you might initially think as being views that you're either on one camp or the other, and yet you can have them both. We have seen that in other cities, right? And so we're seeing it a bit here with some of your residents. We saw that in other cities where there's an appetite for what I would call the carrot programs, right? Put them in, get them connected to counseling, get them connected to rehab. At that same individual can say, and by the way, carry a heavy stick when it comes to any bad behavior with homelessness. I don't want them sleeping in the parks, right? And so it's possible to have both of those sort of suite of views, and we have typically seen that in other places as well, right?
Glad you couldn't gauge level of frustration for answers.
What's that?
Level of frustration.
Level
for
of
answers.
frustration?
Because we're all looking for the answer, and that's elusive.
I think that's part of what it is that, if we had a solution that we all knew would work, right, that wasn't exceedingly expensive, right, we'd all go there, right? But there is a little bit, but there's also in that, I think that's part of also why you're seeing some of the high levels for some of the strategies are like, I'll do this, I'll do that, I support the other. I really don't want the problem to continue the way it is, right?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mayor, if I can just really briefly, Janet, Alexis, can both of you stand up really quickly? Janet and Alexis, both of you. So the reason we're here tonight is actually Janet and Alexis came to my office and challenged some of the views that we had heard in the community, not bad or good, but just we need to get a better perception. And so in our strive to try to understand our homelessness solution in Glendora, which is different from other communities because every city is unique, they are the reason we're here this evening. So a special thank you to them, and they came to Tim. And so you can sit down, sorry about that. Not to embarrass you, but we've had a great relationship with you for several years and several, of these surveys. And in speaking with Tim, he said, we should ask the same 2 questions or 3 questions first to set the baseline and expectations to understand and try to say, hey, is the homelessness issue really rising to the top? And, several months ago when we had an issue around the Civic Center that we worked with our partners to help address, the tensions rose really quickly. So we waited till after that issue went away before we conducted the survey, which allowed it not to be at the forefront or as at the forefront of everyone's mind as we thought. And some of the conclusions in here from a staff perspective, when we reviewed them at a department head level, were just as confusing, I think, as people may hear this evening. It's like, well, 1/3 of residents are split in these numerous different areas. Every solution we'll provide will have a group of residents who are happy and a group of residents who are not. And so as we continue down this path, one of the promises staff made to both the council and the public is that we would try to leave no stone unturned in trying to provide the best solutions for our city. And tonight is a great example of one of those where we're providing more information on the perceptions, educational opportunities that we must provide, and also setting a foundation for future conversations at council. But just wanted to recognize Janet and Alexis, and then thank you very much for all of your efforts. We greatly appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Gary?
One more thing, if you may. There's one more thing that jumped out at me that is a perception that I expected, but I know for a fact this is wrong. The fact that we, according to this, was 5.8% of the people believe that the homeless population that we have lived in Glendora prior to being homeless. And I think maybe Karen or Adam can, you have more information than I do on that. But I think it's probably 50% or more of our homeless population is probably homegrown and our neighbors and kids that grew up here that need some help.
don't have the exact statistics on that. I don't know if Adam does, but I guess there's two ways to look at that. One, those individuals are currently in the city of Glendora, which to me says that they're currently a Glendora resident. So that's one answer. The other answer is that many of them do have other connections of family or prior residence. So
From an anecdotal, without having, so one of the challenges is having really great information on exactly our homeless population in the town, where you're from, name, age, and sort of all of those criteria. Anecdotally, and speaking with the police department, with our community services department, we historically had for many years 20 to 25 homeless individuals that we knew very well, which had a definite connection to the city. As that number in our most recent count that's official is 60, and we expect that to increase. I think it's easy to say between 25% to 1/3 of the homeless population is at least have spent the majority of their lives, if not all of their life, in the city of Glendora.
And the way the question was posed, it looks like it was if they lived in the city prior to being homeless. So again, that's a perception that I would think that most people would have, but that is something that definitely everybody needs to accept that we need to address.
yeah, which is part of that education piece. Yeah.
So this problem is so complex, and we are looking at something that we haven't had to look at in previous years, and there's a lot to learn. And your survey is one important part for us to have that information so that we can know what our residents are expecting, and maybe, as Karen said, places that we need to provide some more education, more engagement. And there's just a lot for us to learn and figure out as we work to do the best we can for our residents, whether they're housed or not housed.
Yeah, and I want to commend you for doing the survey. Like I said, it's the first one. You're not the first city that's wrestled with the issue of homelessness, obviously. You're the first city that I know of that's really dug in deep to understand kind of where the community is at on this, and also look at it as an opportunity not just to, okay, what are their policy preferences, let's go that direction, but where do we need to educate, right, with residents. And I also want to tip my hat to Jana because she's a wealth of information. And when I sat down to design this from scratch, right, she was very helpful in kind of pointing me in certain directions. And then I did my own homework and my own research. And I was like, yeah, here's some great questions we can tie into. And so it was a real collaborative event. And Adam was very supportive all throughout. So it was, you know, I do this a lot for different types of studies. This one was a real pleasure to work on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Have a great night.
Yeah, thank you.